Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Nick.
No, don't do it. No, you can't. You can't do it. We're doing. Oh dear. Today we are looking at Up the Elephant and Round the Castle, a 1980s vehicle for popular comedian Jim Davidson.
Jim Davidson.
Popular then.
So this should go really well and without any controversy.
Yeah, well, obviously, our slogan here at British Sitcom History Podcast is "It was a different time,"
Yeah,
and we'll probably be dealing with that today, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But in Up the Elephant and Round the Castle, we deftly avoid racial issues by not having anyone in it who isn't white.
Yeah,
that's
the East End for you.
That's the technique for dealing with that. But yeah, let's not get into that yet. Let's give ourselves a bit of intro before we get started.
Can we often start with because I'm older than you, my memories of 80s sitcoms. So obviously this was what year? Tell me what year this was.
It started very late 1983
and ran for 3 series. Is that right?
Yep, up till end of 85.
So you were born in 1984, so that rules you out. But I do remember this being on. And the thing that I remember about it was, what a weird name. I had no idea that Elephant and Castle was a place in London until this programme came out. Because it is objectively a weird name. If you live in South London, then you're used to it. But if you don't, it is a weird name for a place.
Elephant and Castle, yeah, just up the road from me. Actually, I'm pretty local to there now.
So the name of the sitcom, Up the Elephant and Round the Castle. Now, I presume is that something that local people say when they're going to Elephant Castle?
I think you would say, "Oh, I live up the elephant," like you would say that. I've never heard anyone say Round the Castle.
But the title itself is the first example of egregious Cockney rhyming slang, shall we say? Maybe it's not rhyming slang, but Cockney patois that we see peppered throughout this sitcom. And I am every time I hear something like there's several occasions on which he refers to children as the old saucepan lids, and I think, do people talk like that? Did people ever talk like that? Certainly in the 1980s, they surely didn't.
Weirdly enough, I heard someone say that yesterday in the wild.
Come on.
Life. Honestly, there's a guy a place where I volunteer, and there's a guy who comes along, and he's a very I sport West Ham, I'm a Cockney geezer kind of fella. And yesterday it was, we had a lot of adults there, not many kids, and he was like, "Hey, where's the saucepan lids, eh? Kids, yeah?" And he always has to explain it every time he says it. But,
well, in fairness, they don't do that explanation thing in Up the Elephant Around the Castle, but there is a lot. I sort of started writing them down. I started writing down all the rhyming slangs. A lot of them peppered throughout.
They do, but when they do explain them, it's because there's a character, a sort of posh character who's completely befuddled by their Cockney ways.
Yeah.
So Jim Davidson, then let's start with him. He is the star. He's the star of this series, and it seems as though it's built around him. It's sort of like, right, what we're going to do with Jim Davidson? Let's write a show for him. Yeah,
definitely.
Because he wasn't an actor. He's not an actor. He was a stand-up comedian.
And without getting into the episode we're going to cover just yet, certainly the first couple of series, that each show opens with Jim, and the character's called Jim, coming out of his front door and basically talking to camera. And it's not quite a stand-up set, but it's basically a stand-up set. And it feels like, okay, it's a bit like the early episodes of Seinfeld, where you were like, okay, this is a stand-up comedian. Let's use what we know he can do before we get into the awkward fact that he can't act.
Yeah, and that's interesting because first of all, it's not really stand-up. It's not him doing a David Letterman monologue.
No,
it's him just introing the show and talking to the audience directly, which is not something that happens in the show. He doesn't break the fourth wall. No. It's just an odd
It's a setup narrative, isn't it? It's a sort of intro to where we're about to, what we're about to see. But there are jokes. It has the cadence of stand-up comedy. It doesn't have the laughs of stand-up comedy, but that's a different matter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the interesting thing is that this show was largely put together by Spike Mullins, the writer Spike Mullins, who is a sketch and gag writer, not a sitcom writer, but is best known because he wrote the bulk of those Ronnie Corbett sat in the chair monologues.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So he's a guy who likes to write monologues, you've got an actor who is used to standing up and talking in front of people rather than acting. So it seems like let's put these together, right? Yeah.
Are we working towards here? Jim Davidson is no Ronnie Corbett. Because I'm very comfortable with that.
But yeah, I think the problem is, I honestly, there was a few of them where I was like, imagine Ronnie Corbett telling this, and it would work, and it'd be getting laughs.
Interesting.
Davidson doesn't have the timing for it. To give him some credit, it feels under-rehearsed. It feels like, whether whoever's fault that is, it feels like he's been over it a couple of times. And
I'll tell you something I noticed, Alan, that it's a sort of two-camera setup. He's talking to one camera, and then he'll turn and look at another camera. And there were several times across several different episodes where he missed the cue, and he was late turning to the camera switch. I don't know much about the technicalities of it, but surely you can do another take of that.
God, do you know what? Everyone is looking for geezers with experience and education. I mean, look at this. Poverty is not the root cause of crime waves. What a daft thing to say, eh? Be fair. I mean, if we was all lowly, we wouldn't need to do noughties, would we? I mean, how often do you look in a paper and see wealthy industrialist does gas meter, or 6 millionaires set about pensioner in the high street? Nah, it's being skint what makes innocent people get up to naught, isn't it? Even little kids, little saucepan lids are getting at it.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. Very noticeable, that sort of thing. Because it's not something you see. Like, the crew are well drilled. The crew don't make those mistakes.
No, there's the sort of thing that you see on like a live news broadcast, not in a sitcom.
Yeah, very sloppy, some of this stuff. It does feel a little bit cheap, doesn't it? The whole thing.
Yeah, the set's quite cheap. So that opening scene, we're sort of in the street outside, and we sometimes use that set during the episode as well. And then the other set, basically, there's the pub, and then there's in his house. He's got like a one-room bedsit type thing.
It's supposed to look a mess and crap, so like that helps.
But that's not what I mean. I mean it looks, fake.
That street set is huge because they open with a giant sort of panning shot like down the street. That's a big set that they've put together there.
Yeah.
And it's underused for what they've done. It's got these huge backdrops as well.
Yeah, there's a bad matte painting of St. Paul's in the background.
Yeah, and it's just not good enough, is it? Basically, that's why go to that effort?
We just watched Porridge before this, didn't we? And can you compare it to the way that Porridge, the sets of Porridge were put together, and how realistic that looked? I don't know if you remember. I was surprised it wasn't a real prison when we were discussing it. Whereas this looks like a television studio. And
you'll notice it's all studio stuff. There's no location shooting, which again you might not need it for what you're doing, but I think that's a budgetary concern as well.
There's one other thing about that opening sequence is it shows you, it sort of pans down to his house, and there's a bottle of milk on the step, like what you used to have. And there's this like sort of shopping bike outside his house, because you used to be able to leave your bike outside. Nobody would nick it. You could leave your doors open. And I'm doing all of this in my head, basically being completely, I'm being completely unfair to Jim Davidson. I'm sort of imagining him saying, "Oh, it's not the same anymore, is it? Now you've got all them foreigns." And I'm like, why am I doing this? This is not fair. Like, why am I assigning these views to Jim Davidson?
Yeah. Well, perhaps he's done something over the years.
Well, shall we talk about that? Let's talk about before we get back into the show itself. I think we need to talk about the elephant, so to speak, in the room.
The elephant in the castle.
It is an objectively stupid name for a town, Elephant and Castle. There is no way around it.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Let's talk about Jim Davidson.
Yes. Okay.
So let's go back in time first. So what did he do before this?
Well, he's still a fairly young man here. He was just a working class kid. Like he's not from Elephant and Castle, but he's a London Cockney cheeky chappy, and he was just doing odd jobs in a sort of cheeky Cockney way, getting by, and doing gigs as a comic. He just wanted to be a comic, really, and he got his big break through New Faces.
Yes.
And so New Faces was like Britain's Got Talent, right, of the 70s.
Yeah. Well, New Faces, it ran originally from 1973 to 78, so it was before my time. But then it was revived in the 80s, and I remember that revival. I remember that being a thing. And yeah, it was certainly... Well, it was long before Britain's Got Talent, but it was back in the days when... I'm going to sound like an old man here. It was back in the days when talent shows were about the talent and not about the backstory. You didn't get a VT of them and their granny and on her deathbed and all that stuff. You're just like, can he sing? Are his jokes funny? Here's the clapometer. I think, do you know what? I think I've mixed... The other the other big talent show in the 70s was Opportunity Knocks. And I think the clapometer was Opportunity Knocks, not New Faces. But, yeah, basically they were the same thing. Yeah, so I think these old talent shows were more... Like, you used to have variety shows on the telly, Live at London Palladium and Saturday Night Special and all that kind of thing, where you'd just have, like, a bill of acts. There'd be a comedian, there'd be a singer, there might be a juggler, or, those sorts of variety acts. That was a lot more popular back then on television.
Yeah.
And so the talent shows, like New Faces, followed a similar format. They were basically trying to find people who would feed into that circuit.
So quite a few people came through that sort of system that we still...
Yeah, what would happen is there'd be a sort of competition every week with several acts, and there would be a winner. And then there was a sort of grand final at the end. So Jim Davidson didn't win the series, but he won, he was a winner that week, so to speak. But also, I made a list of sort of famous names that came through.
Oh, yeah.
Like the first, well, not the first winner, but the runner-up in the first series was Shawaddy Waddy, which is a name from the past. But that year also, Les Dennis of Extras fame. That's a sitcom connection. Les Dennis is a really good example of that kind of variety show comedian. Pretty harmless, but not controversial. No difficulty putting him on a Saturday night.
Few gags, some impressions, end with a song.
Exactly right, yes. And that was the kind of thing that they were doing. Victoria Wood was on New Faces, very famously. So, we have a Dinner Ladies connection there. Lenny Henry came through New Faces.
Doing, Betty. He's doing the classics.
There's a couple of other sitcom connections. Marty Kane was primarily a comedian, but she was in a couple of sitcoms. And then other names that are more comedians, people like Michael Barrymore, Roy Walker was on New Faces. But perhaps most controversial, most relevant, someone who appeared on New Faces was Roy Chubby Brown in 1977.
Really?
Which apparently is the last time he was on television. I'm not sure that's true, because I think he was in The League of Gentlemen, wasn't he? But apparently that's the legend. He was on television, and then his act was so bad that they wouldn't put him on ever again.
Did he have his work 5 minutes clean, or did he go blue?
Well, I mean, it was Saturday night TV, so it must have been. He must have had some clean material. But I think that's perhaps the relevant comparison for us here with Jim Davidson, because Jim Davidson obviously has this controversial reputation as being a little bit old-fashioned in his attitudes. Mm-hmm. And yes, it was a different time, but the criticism of Jim Davidson is that he hasn't really changed with the times.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think he's old-fashioned now, but was he 40 years ago?
This is my point. Not only was he enormously popular in 1983 when this sitcom came out, but he continued to be enormously popular, presenting huge prime... Big Break was a massive show. He presented The Generation Game, which was a real tentpole of the BBC primetime schedules. He was huge. No, he was very popular and not controversial in the 1980s. Not at all.
Yeah. It was a different time. But yeah, this sitcom, followed by Home James, which in theory is a sequel, but is essentially a different sitcom. Mm. That's pretty much the only acting he's done. Yeah. He's done his own sort of pantomimes, and obviously that's acting.
Well, I would argue that he's not really acting.
Yeah.
Whether or not you like his performance in this, it's him. It's him. Perhaps it's his persona, his comedic persona, but it's him. It's not a... Yeah,
they've written a character that he doesn't... I mean, the character's called Jim London. I mean, how basic can we get? Yeah, he's a London lad, and he's called Jim. But that was kind of how it was done in those days, wasn't it? If you wanted to put a comedian... I mean, look at Miranda. It's not... That the character she's playing is the same as the persona she has on stage, and
yes.
It's an amped up version of what appears to be her if you see her interviewed and everything.
Yeah.
So that's how you do it, that's fair enough. And he was established by this point. He came through in the mid-70s. He had his own show called The Jim Davidson Show in the early 80s. And so this is what came after. It's not exactly well remembered now.
No. I mentioned this to a few people, this is what we're doing next, and anyone younger than me had not heard of it.
And I don't think it did any major business at the time. It's not like it was big in its day. Obviously big enough to get a few series out of it, but that was it. If we want to talk about Jim Davidson a bit, like where he is now, he went on from this, did Home James, and then not long after that, basically started hosting Big Break, and that was his bread and butter for 10 years. And I remember Big Break, that's my era of TV, the 90s. And yeah, it was him and John Virgo, great bit of patter, some snooker-based shenanigans.
Oh, everybody loves snooker-based shenanigans.
It was a time when snooker was actually popular for this brief period.
It's fine, isn't it? I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Big Break. I watched Big Break. I'm not saying it was rubbish. What I'm saying is it's mystifying when you look back now that we used to watch that rubbish.
A snooker-based game show. Yeah. So, but then, yes, and then in the mid-90s, he took over as from Brucey. I mean, what a mantle to take that. He said to do the Generation Game. Like, it doesn't get bigger than the Generation Game in the 90s. That was Saturday night prime time. He was the Gary Lineker of his day. He's getting the BBC's golden boy.
And not controversial. This is my point. You know, there weren't people saying, oh, he shouldn't be doing this, he's racist. I'm not saying he was universally popular, but it wasn't controversial.
And it's quite interesting that a lot of people, a lot of acts, perhaps more then than now, had that double life of the clean-cut, well-spoken host on the BBC, and then you go and see them at the club and they work in blue. Bob Monkhouse, did all that.
Perhaps that's a consequence of the all-pervasive nature of media now, in that if you went and did some blue material or some off-colour material in a club, someone's filmed it, someone's posted it on Twitter and you're cancelled, Whereas you could kind of have that as two separate personas.
It was because that it wasn't like they were going to the club and doing something that was forbidden. That was how it was in the club. The problem was the BBC weren't going to show that, so you can't do that. You have to be able to do your clean material.
Yeah,
and so you have to have these two sides, and that's about balance that lots of people did, like you say, yeah. And then there was people who couldn't do it, which is why Bernard Manning never presented, Bullseye, because he couldn't stop himself.
Yeah.
Whereas Jim Davidson, obviously, and he seems for all the, I'm going to slag Jim Davidson off quite a lot in this.
Yeah, I feel like we're being too nice to him at the moment,
but I think he does have a kind of a likable nature to him.
He's charming.
Yeah, he's charming. He's a cheeky chappy, and he can do that, like poking fun at a housewife from Somerset. Because she's tried to make a clay pot and made a mess of it. Like you can yeah. Make fun of her and it's okay and not just sound like you're being nasty. That's a great skill to have, and obviously it earned him a nice little fortune throughout the 90s. But just that all came to an end, and why is this? Who knows? But in 2002, the big break ended, and maybe that it had just
2002,
that
right?
point.
Okay, so that's 20 years ago, but that's probably a little later than I would have guessed, actually.
Yeah, and maybe it had been on a downturn, it had lived its life, that's fine. And then in the same year he stopped presenting the Generation Game, which did carry on, didn't it? I think they went on with
it. Well, they revived it several times, Generation Games. It's one of those things that keeps coming back like a zombie format.
But basically that meant Jim Davidson in 2002 had the carpet pulled from beneath him. Like whatever he was earning at the BBC, it was gone.
Was there some expose of something he'd said that led to all this?
No. I think the BBC are at the forefront of political correctness, let's say, because they're the ones who are going to have to answer to the public more often than anyone else. I don't know. Maybe they're just going, look, you're out doing Cinderella, the pantomime, and it's not good for the brand, and there's only so much of a disconnect you can make there. Yeah. Like you say, in the 70s, perhaps it's different to in 2002. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe it was just he's been forefront of the TV for 10 years and people are sick of him and we need to move on to someone else.
That does happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's
but it's certainly, from what I don't follow Jim Davidson particularly, but whenever you do hear him, he is perhaps understandably defensive and a little angry about the way that he's perceived. And which I don't think helps. It becomes a very confrontational situation, doesn't it? It becomes a very polarised debate.
Yeah. But that's it. I mean, maybe you just fall out of fashion and we've had enough of Jim Davidson. But, I mean, it was bad for him because, his major income was gone. And very quickly after that, he was declared bankrupt. He was trying
really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, he's got like 5 ex-wives, 6 kids and whatever it is. So it's like he's paying money out all over the place. It was the tax man that bankrupted him. He couldn't pay. He couldn't pay the tax. So, and I know he ran off to Dubai for a good few years as well, just to get away from the tax man, I guess. But yeah, I mean I owe anyone who voluntarily lives in Dubai as suspect as far as I'm
concerned. Maybe they've just got great sporting facilities there.
But he's had his moments. He won Celebrity Big Brother in 2014, apparently.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not particularly familiar with that, but he's.
But what's interesting about it is that's a public vote, isn't it? So I think he would have taken some positive from that.
And that's so that's 8 years ago. He would have been about 60, 61 then. So that was perhaps the late career revival that he could have turned into something else. Doesn't seem like he has.
What does he do now? Like, how does he make a living now?
He's got his own like social media platform, like a YouTube knockoff, which I assume, I haven't looked into it in a great deal, but I assume it's like, well, YouTube won't let us say these things, so come over here and we can say them. Kind of vibe to it. I've seen a few clips of him just pontificating. He just sits in front of a green screen and talks about things. And it's like, if there's any chance 10 years ago of him kind of going the right direction, he's very much now like, oh, you know what they're saying now. You can't have white swans anymore. You've got to have at least 2 black swans in every lake, otherwise the council will come and shut you down.
This is the problem, I think. We see this a lot, like in the trans debate now, where you can't really have any nuance, and you can kind of understand someone like Jim Davidson, who has basically been told he's bad and lost his job. You can kind of understand them doubling down, can't you, and feeling embittered and feeling marginalised. And finding their community, finding the people who agree with them. I understand that trajectory.
And I think this is fairly normal for the people who are in that type of spotlight. I think Jim Davidson does understand the nuance. I think he does. I think he can look at his material and go, okay, I see the damage that has done, or I can see why I can't say that anymore. But I think the people who are commenting on it, and if you look at the YouTube comments on his videos and stuff, they don't know. They don't know that nuance. And Jim Davidson has made either conscious or unconscious decision to court that audience.
Yes.
And make his money off those people.
One point I did want to make is that I don't think I've ever seen, or if I have, I don't remember, just stand-up. Jim Davidson just doing a stand-up comedy. I think I probably did see it in the 1980s. Like I say, he was a TV variety comedian. But I don't really remember. I was only a kid. The reason I'm bringing that up is that the closest thing we get to it in Up the Elephant Around the Castle is those opening monologues. And as I said earlier, I don't really like them. I don't think they're very good. And you mentioned Bernard Manning earlier. The thing that people always say about Bernard Manning, he was a technically gifted comedian, and he could craft a joke and his timing was perfect and all these things. It was just that his material was not okay. Mm. The evidence of this sitcom is that Jim Davidson was not a good comedian. Now, I don't think that's fair. I think he must have been better than these opening monologues suggest. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had the success he had. But it's certainly not a good showcase for him.
Yeah, I agree. And I have watched some of his comedy. I specifically went and watched some for this, research for this. And the thing I watched specifically was from about 93, I think. So really at his peak. And it's some pretty off-the-shelf kind of gags. Nothing too great, and a lot of talk about how he's really controversial and like, oh, people are going to walk out. You didn't think, I thought he was nice on that big break. A lot of that kind of stuff.
Is he doing a Gervais? So this is the problem with Ricky Gervais now, isn't he? He seems to think that being controversial is more important than actually telling jokes.
Well, they don't. I don't think they get on.
But I think it's the same. I think it's the same problem. I think Ricky Gervais has got the same thing where he feels like he's been so criticised that he gets defensive, and then you just turn into this defensive, justifying your actions without sort of forgetting what you're there for. Yeah. They say that about Lenny Bruce. By the time he died, his act was unwatchable because he was just complaining about the police trying to shut him up.
Yeah, the Graham Linehan effect, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that goes on, and it's very easy to fall into that trap as well. And I think more so now than ever with your old social media feedback loop and all that. Mm. I tell you what really works for Jim Davidson's act and what he is good at, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's always politically correct, but what he's good at is doing characters.
What stand-up comedians called act-outs.
Little gaggy bits like that, yeah. And obviously his most famous one is Chalky, which is a sort of stereotypical Jamaican, West Indian, vaguely West Indian accent. But he embodies the character really nicely, and I think those are the funnier moments. Just you need to find a way to do that where you're not putting people down. I think is probably the only way to do it.
He's quite a physical performer, isn't he? He sort of uses his body and he moves and. When he's doing those act outs, you can see him embodying the character.
Yeah, and I think that's one of his strengths, and maybe see more of that. But then, so why then is he not that great an actor in Up the Elephant and Round the Castle?
Well, indeed, yeah.
Let's get into the actual show then, shall we?
Yeah, let's for the benefit of our listeners, there are 3 series. The episode that we're focusing on is Series 2, Episode 4, Come to the Aid of the Party, which is I'm really now just reading that the title of the episode, "Come to the Aid of the Party." I genuinely don't know what that means. Like, is that a pun? Is that?
I'm not sure.
Like, for example, I've got some other episode titles here. "And They Came Unto Jim," "The Spy Who Left Me," "The Pied Piper of Hamlet." Okay, we got the bad puns, but they're puns. What is "Come to the Aid of the Party"? If any of our listeners know what the hell that's supposed to mean, then please do tell us.
Let's start with the opening then, I guess.
Well, what about the titles? Because we talked about the way that it's structured, but before we see Jim coming out of his door and talking to us, what about the titles? You've got that panning shot of the set that comes down to his front door. What about the music? What do you think of the music?
I'm all right with the music. It feels very sitcom-y, standard 80s music. I don't think it jumps out at me or anything.
I didn't like it. It's this sort of plinky-plonky piano thing, but then it's got this weird vibrato thing going on. I don't know what the hell. Like, I'm not a music guy. I don't know what the instrument was.
I did note that in the credits, the theme music is credited to Keith Emerson.
Who's he?
As in Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Shut up!
Well, that's Keith Emerson. Like, unless there's another Keith Emerson who does keyboard music for sitcom. I think this was in the 80s. He was like past his peak and just churning stuff out for the BBC.
Wow. He must have been, if you will forgive me, Brassic Lint.
That means he has no money. He's skint. It's rhyming slang.
Let me just tick that off my list. I'll get to the others as we go on. So yeah, we spin in, we get Jim's front door, and out he walks to talk to us. Now, one point in every episode until this one, he's come out in his dressing gown. Jim Davidson is not a physical specimen, is he? He's got very spindly little legs.
Yeah.
However, in this episode, he's dressed, which is a blessing.
Well, I noticed actually what happens in this episode is we go straight from the monologue into the scene, as opposed to like he would normally go, oh God, that reminds me, last Tuesday this happened, and then he would kind of
sort of fade into the scene. Yeah,
this actually works straight into the scene where his neighbour comes out and the story begins. They did phase out the monologue in series 3. They obviously realised that wasn't doing anything for anyone, so perhaps they were already working.
So a couple of things on this. He says he's dressed and up early for the post. Now, I have questions. In 1984, when this went out, did the postman bring the post and then take it away if you weren't out of bed?
Hey, morning, Will. You're probably wondering why I'm up and about this morning. I want to catch the postman, don't I? Important letter. Oh, look at this. OHMS. Only Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs. Well, it is not good for me, what is it?
And then he does an accent. Unclear whether it's a Hindu, Muslim or a Sikh accent.
It doesn't matter, actually, in the 80s. It didn't make a difference. But I wanted to ask, what is the OHMS?
On Her Majesty's Service. It basically means a tax bill, I think.
Right, yeah. So why is it for Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs?
I don't know. I don't get it. It was just an opportunity to do an accent.
It's not to be some reason why...
No, it's not.
I don't know. Okay, I don't know.
And then he opens another envelope. It's a TV license demand. He's not going to pay that. Of course he's not. He's a benefit cheat.
I think I could write an entire essay on the art of opening letters in front of a live audience, the different methods we have to go through because...
Okay, this is very on brand for our podcast. Talk to me about opening letters in front of an audience.
Because you'll see in sitcoms where they have to open a letter and then it's like, we haven't got time to mess about, and they just sort of rabidly rip it apart because they need to get to it. Oh yeah, we need to get to this letter. We're here on this show, they've gone with the envelopes aren't sealed, just open them and pull the letter out technique.
This is great observation, Alan. I didn't even notice that. So the letter that he's anticipating, this is the letter I'm waiting for. And I'm thinking, this is the setup for the episode. It's not. It's a letter from the Playboy Club. Oh, yeah. Thank you for your letter offering to house a retired bunny girl. Unfortunately, and then he screws it up. That's the joke. Like, that's why he's got up early.
Yeah. Worth a try, though, isn't it? Yes, but one of the other letters he receives, and so we do set up the plot here, is a council tax bill, basically. Rates demand.
Yeah, so his neighbour, who it turns out works for the council, comes along. And they start by talking about TV licence fee, and then they start to talk about the rates. Arnie, his neighbour, is suggesting that it might be a good idea for him to contribute towards society. Clearly that doesn't work. And so he suggests that Jim tries to get his house reassessed so he can go into a lower council tax band. So that's the setup for the episode.
Just for the setup for the show, by the way, just for anyone who's not aware, the idea is that Jim Landon's aunt has died and left him this house. So he owns this house in a sort of rundown area, and so that's why he can kind of just scrape by on the benefits, because he's got a place to live, and then he's just so he's a bit of a cheeky Cockney wide boy trying to scrape together a living. So that's kind of the general gist of the show. But then, apparently never realised that you have to pay council tax on a house.
Can we just before we go on, Alan? Can we stop calling it a house? It's a drum. Aunt Mim popped off and left me a drum.
A drum. Hang on, let me work this one out. Drum.
I don't know. I know that drum is house. I know that is
drum
the thing.
and
drum and bass. No,
drum and bass. My place. Drum and bass.
It could be.
There's nothing else. There's nothing else that goes with drum.
Drum and mouse. No, not a thing. If any of our listeners are from South London and the 1930s, then please do let us know what the hell that means.
The councillor there, so his neighbour, Councillor Moggs, Arnold Moggs.
Arnold Moggs. He sounds like a bit of a nerd. What a nerdy name, Arnold Moggs is.
This is Nicholas Day playing the characters, and very much falls into what I like to call Peter Denyer acting.
Yes.
In reference to our Dear John episode.
Yes.
Peter Denyer playing the most basic stereotype nerd character that you could possibly dream up, and we're definitely falling into the same category here.
Yeah, he hasn't got tape on his glasses, but he's certainly got glasses.
Yeah, and he's the fastidious, officious councillor type. I think you'll find you need a permit for that kind of vibe. And he lives next door to Jim London, so obviously they're at conflict quite regularly. And he is a regular character. And he's actually a replacement for a character in the first series who lives next door to him, who is a councillor, played by a different actor. And it has a different character name. But obviously that actor wasn't available later on, so they've replaced him. Nicholas Day, funnily enough, appeared in Series 1 as a different character, but very much a similar character. It's when Jim's going to sign on at the DHSS, and one of the fastidious officious workers there is trying to catch him doing work on the sly. So it's basically exactly the same character, but without the glasses.
Do you know what my problem with this character / interaction is? I'm on his side. Pay your bloody council tax.
Yeah, well, that's it.
The bins need emptying. Pay your council tax.
He goes, yeah, look, it pays for the not Oh yeah, he's not happy about that. Yeah. Jim London is not on the side of the police.
No.
The first series has 6 different writers for the 6 episodes. Now, Spike Mullins, as I said, I think he devised this, and he's credited as the script editor. So I think he was the overarching kind of keeping an eye on things over the series. And in the later series, he writes more episodes. But originally, he wrote the first episode, and then other people write all the others. And that's interesting because Spike Mullins was like a working class Cockney cheeky chappy boy, and did all these kind of just knockabout jobs, just scraping a living. And in fact, he only became a writer much later in life, or at least professional writer. Much later in life. He was in his late 40s when he first got a proper job, and he wrote gags and sketches for everyone, all your classics of that era. And this was interesting, right? Obviously, because he was a bit older when he's working on like the Frost Report and stuff like that, and all these Oxbridge types. So he's giving a slightly different perspective, which is great. But also they wanted to make sure we need to have that younger voice, so they teamed him up with younger writers just to make sure that they always worked. So who do you think that, if you want a young man's perspective, who do you think they teamed him up with?
Go on.
Barry Cryer.
Well,
so it gives you some idea of how long ago that was. Was he? This, from Spike Mullins' point of view, I think he grew up in this kind of environment, and he knew what this life was. But also, by the time he was writing this, he was in his late 60s. And perhaps we're already dealing with a London that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe this is Spike Mullins' London of the 1950s rather than Jim Davidson's London of the 1980s.
Yeah, that's what I thought, yeah.
I found that very interesting. But the writers, the kind of, it's a different writer every time, and it's a bunch of jobbing writers, frankly. And like none of them have exactly gone on to be huge names that we're going to recognise. This episode was written by Louise Ford.
Louise Ford?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, a woman. That's good.
Yes, it does sound like a
But I
woman's
don't know the name.
Yes, well, there is a Louise Ford that's active now who's fairly well known, but she's obviously not the same one. She's much younger. I looked at Louise Ford as a writer, as a sitcom writer in the 80s. There is no evidence that this person exists apart from this credit. I do not know who they are. I assume they're a woman because their name is Louise, but that is unusual in itself in the 80s. And because Louise Ford is a fairly common name, it's like I can't Google it. And there isn't a comedy actor, writer called Louise Ford now, who's obviously much younger. So it's just impossible to find any information.
Right, okay, interesting.
There's with different writers on all these episodes, it's sort of gloriously inconsistent. There's some really weird things. Like it just doesn't tonally. It feels different every episode. So Anita Dobson is in a couple of episodes of the first series as a kind of love interest, but she's in 2 separate episodes, same character name. Totally different characterization, just like as if it's 2 completely separate characters.
Oh.
Just for example, and there's quite a lot of this in the first series, particularly where there's these characters that are just dropped in, and then they kind of go, yeah, there's nothing there. And then it's sort of in the second series where they settle a little bit more.
That's interesting because I have questions because I watched 2 episodes from each series, and there were characters coming up that I just thought, well, who's this? It wasn't obvious where they fitted in. And I thought, well, fair enough, because I've not watched every episode. I've missed, the setup here, but evidently not.
No, they do settle down a bit more as we go along. So, for example, we have Sue Nichols as the neighbour, Wanda Pickles.
Well, let's come back to our episode because this is very timely. So we go from the conversation about not paying his council tax. We've set up the episode. He's going to get his council tax reassessed. His rate reassessed before council tax. And then we go into the house for the next scene. And in walks Wanda Pickles, who is his neighbour.
Well, Sue Nichols off of Coronation Street. I mean, that's what she's known for these days, isn't she? But
we've seen her. Where have we seen her before? What she popped up in?
Well, I don't know if we've looked at her directly, but she was in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin as a series regular in that.
Ah, yes. And when we talked about that when we talked about Rising Damp, I think.
Yeah, and she was in Rent a Ghost. She was a regular in that. That might be from your childhood.
I've talked about Rent a Ghost before. Very much my timeline. Early 80s kids comedy. That's if you said Sue Nichols off of Coronation Street, and I accept that is objectively true. But to me, she's Sue Nichols off of Rent a Ghost.
Yeah, so she's been in Coronation Street since the early 80s. I think she's been a series regular since 85, which is when this show finished, I guess. But yeah, in the 70s she was in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. In the 60s she was in Crossroads. I think she was one of the original cast members of Crossroads, like when that started. Okay. Interesting little trivia I found out about her. Her father was a Conservative MP. And was sent up to the Lords later on as well, so he was a life peer. Okay. So fancy background there to go and be in Coronation Street for 40 years.
Let me ask you this, and this is in the context of her performance in Up the Elephant Round the Castle. Where is she from?
Yeah,
because that's quite an accent. She's certainly not from South London. I'm telling you that much.
Maybe he's from Manchester. That would make sense for Coronation Street. Right?
She sounded like she was doing a Brummie accent, but badly.
Well, that's London, isn't it? People come from all over the place.
Well, I must say, you was looking very good last night.
Last night?
In my dream, I had this sexy dream about you, Jim. Oh, you looked like Michael Caine, you did. You was driving this Maserati, and you were going to whisk me away to Bermuda.
So her character, she's a little older than Jim. She's flirty, but then we sort of learn that she's married to a mobster who's in prison and a bit dangerous.
Yeah.
So Jim finds her a little bit of a threat.
The whole character is that she's like quite an aggressive cougar going after this younger man, and there's a lot of that in this. So in the show in general, I've seen, I look at forums, you see people commenting on it, and it's often people who haven't seen it for years, they go, oh, I remember this, it was like this, it was like this. They remember it as this very smutty, almost Carry-On style, confessions of a Cockney
there's some
chappie.
certainly Benny Hill style lovely ladies about to appear.
That's an unusual element, though, and
okay,
it's actually not smutty at all. There's really, he's often trying to get. He never even gets to the point where he's like trying to get someone in bed, like Reg Varney. It's like he's trying to get a date with a woman, and like it's going wrong. It's he never gets anywhere near smut. And the only women who are like, and this is classic sitcom, by the way, a woman throwing themselves at a man, and the man's like, "Oh God, no thanks, love," because she's dowdy and Olive from On the Buses, obvious example.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that too.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a later character in this that does it. So 2 scenes in a row, basically, they have exactly the same thing here, where a woman is throwing themselves at Jim.
Yeah. So we've got Sue Nichols throwing herself at him, and he's basically terrified.
Yeah,
fighting her off.
And they even have to explain that the main reason he's terrified is because her husband's it would be trouble if he tries to go down that road, as opposed to just maybe he doesn't fancy Sue Nichols, who for some reason is like in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, she's like the sexy secretary that is tempting Reginald Perrin.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't get it. Maybe that's a matter of taste.
She's a very attractive woman.
I guess it's subjective, but
one point about this scene, it was Jim's fending her off. He, he uses all his comedic skills to fend her off, and there's a contrived Michael Caine impression. Now, everybody can do a Michael Caine impression, right? Everybody can do a Michael Caine.
Wonder if you think I could whiz you away to Bermuda. I can just about afford the cab fare to Bermondsey.
No, Jim.
2 questions. Number 1, why can't Jim Davidson do a Michael Caine impression? Number 2, with that now established, why have they written that into this script?
There's quite a few bits in here where...
Like, he does voices. Some of them are racist. He does good voices. He does not do a good Michael Caine impression.
He does it quite a lot, though. So it's obviously part of his repertoire, so they wrote it in. Not a lot of people know that.
Well, that was as bad.
We'll see later on. Maybe we'll come to this later, but he does his Zippy off of Rainbow impression.
Oh, the Zippy off of Rainbow.
One out of every 3 episodes.
That came up so much.
Jeffrey, what has occurred?
He does that all the time, and he does it in home.
But I think that's a pretty universal impression as well. Like, everybody knew in 1983.
At least in the 80s it was.
Zippy off of Rainbow. Yeah.
Well, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, this week, but do come back next time when we will continue our journey around the elephant and up the castle. In the meantime, do join us on social media. We are at BritcomPod on Twitter and Instagram. We're also on Facebook. Just search for British Sitcom History Podcast. That should be enough. We are also on YouTube. Search for the same and you will find us. We have the podcast with video enhancement, clips from the shows, and also other video-related content on there. We have a very healthy back catalogue now of other sitcoms we've looked at, so if you're new here, do please go back and enjoy some of the other things. And if you're Jim Davidson, then I'm sorry, and we will be a bit nicer to you next time, so come back. Thank you for listening.